Welcome back to History They Buried, where the past is never truly dead, just hidden. Each day we unearth the forgotten, the covered up, and the unspeakable truths buried beneath everyday lives. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Galvin family, a Colorado household of 12 children who, behind closed doors, carried one of the darkest secrets in American medical history. But to understand their story, we must first understand a truth that Mississippi itself has whispered for generations, that tragedy leaves echoes. From the restless halls of the McRaven House, to the cursed waters beneath Stuckey's bridge, to the lonely grandeur of Mount Helena, the South has long known that what happens inside a home doesn't always stay there. Sometimes it seeps into the walls, sometimes it clings to blood, and sometimes it refuses to die. The Galvins were no different. To neighbors, they were the perfect picture of post-war America. Don and Mimi Galvin built a house on Hidden Valley Road, raised their 12 children with the appearance of discipline and love, and embodied the ideal suburban family. But beneath that surface, their household was unraveling into chaos, one that science could not explain, and one that faith could not cleanse. The first crack in that illusion appeared in their eldest son, Donald. His outbursts were dismissed at first as youthful rebellion, but as months passed, his violence became impossible to ignore. He heard voices no one else could hear. He claimed he was being watched, stalked by shadows. At times his eyes turned wild, not with anger, but with terror, as though he had seen something the rest of the family could not. In Mississippi, old stories warn of people touched by unseen forces, of men who stand on Stuckey's bridge and swear they hear whispers in the wind, of women in Mount Helena who speak of figures drifting through rooms long abandoned. Donald's decline echoed that same unease, a haunting not of place but of mind, and once it began, the rest of the family could not escape it. Hidden Valley Road would become a house where 12 siblings lived, and where nearly half of them would descend into madness. Doctors would later call it schizophrenia. Neighbors would call it misfortune. But for those who lived inside, it felt like a curse, one as real and suffocating as any ghost that haunts the South. Before we continue with the story and its unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand that some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? A family collapsing under forces they neither understood nor controlled. Donald was only the first. What followed would consume the Galvins for generations. Mississippi's haunted legends remind us of one chilling truth. Curses rarely strike once. A spirit at Stuckey's bridge may whisper endlessly to those who linger, and the Mount Helena mansion is said to trap sorrow in its very walls. In the Galvin home, that same pattern of recurrence soon began to unfold. Donald was not an isolated case. He was the first of many. By the early 1970s, the Galvin household was no longer just noisy with the commotion of 12 children. It was filled with tension so heavy it made silence dangerous. Donald's unpredictable rages terrified his younger siblings. He attacked without warning, once smashing his brother's head into a wall, another time chasing a sister through the house with scissors in hand. His parents, Don and Mimi, dismissed it as illness, but inside the family, fear ruled. Soon, his younger brother Jim began to show signs as well. He withdrew from friends, muttered to himself, and claimed he could hear voices carried through the static of the radio. Another brother, Brian, started pacing at night, staring into corners, whispering under his breath as though in secret conversation. By the time the third brother spiraled, the rest of the family had stopped asking if something was wrong. They knew it was. Doctors offered no clarity. At first, they spoke of stress, of family dynamics, even of bad parenting. But as the years passed, the diagnosis hardened into a single word: schizophrenia. a word that in those decades carried almost no answers, only stigma and fear. For Mimi, the mother, it became a daily war. She pressed harder for discipline, determined that strict control would contain the storm. But it didn't. Instead, her rules only created more secrecy, more shame. Some siblings began hiding their symptoms, others lashed out. The Galvin children were trapped in a cycle where illness was seen as weakness, and Agnes was punished. And yet, there was something more unsettling than the violence or the madness. Visitors to the home often described an atmosphere they couldn't quite name, a heaviness, as though the house itself was suffocating. In Mississippi, storytellers speak of the McRaven House as the most haunted in the South because of its lingering sense of grief and unrest. The Galvin home, though far away in Colorado, felt eerily similar, a place where suffering didn't stay hidden but seeped into every room, every breath. The unraveling had begun. 3 sons were already consumed by something beyond their control, and 9 siblings remained, waiting for their turn, or fearing it. Next, we discover how Mimi's desperate attempts to hold her family together would only tighten the noose around her children's lives. Mimi Galvin had always been described as proud, meticulous, and determined. To the outside world, she was the image of a devoted mother, raising 12 children in the American dream of the 1950s and 60s. But inside her own home, that dream was collapsing, one child at a time. With 3 sons already showing terrifying signs of schizophrenia, Mimi refused to accept that something larger was at work. To her, these weren't spirits, curses, or madness. They were simply weaknesses to be ironed out. She doubled down on order. Meals at strict times, chores executed perfectly, no excuses, no softness. But the truth was harder to silence. Donald's rages could not be hidden when he left bruises on siblings. Jim's ramblings could not be ignored when neighbors overheard his late-night shouting, and Brian's pacing through the halls gave the house the feeling of a restless ghost. The cracks were widening. Mimi's solution was discipline, but her approach became its own cruelty. She would punish the unstable children harshly, determined to snap them back into normalcy. Yet, the more she forced order, the more chaos rose. The house itself seemed to mirror this tension, walls shaking with slammed doors, screams echoing through the halls, siblings whispering in fear. In Mississippi folklore, there's a story about Mount Helena Mansion, a grand house built on a plantation mound, where tragedy struck repeatedly until locals began to say the land itself was cursed. The Galvin family's home, though not a mansion, carried that same kind of shadow, a place where no matter how much one tried to control life, suffering crept back in, silent, persistent, unstoppable. The other siblings, especially the younger ones, learned to live in dread. They never knew which brother would explode or when their mother's fury would fall upon them. Every day felt like walking on a cracked floor, one step away from collapse. And Mimi? She believed she was fighting for her family's survival. What she didn't see was that her grip meant to hold everything together was squeezing the life out of those she loved. Next, we uncover how violence within the household began to spill outward, dragging the Galvin family into the public eye, and how whispers of shame would only deepen their isolation. The Galvin family's carefully guarded facade was beginning to crack. For years, their home had been a private battleground, hidden behind closed curtains and polite Sunday smiles. But violence has a way of leaving marks that cannot stay hidden forever. Donald, the eldest son, was the first to truly step beyond the boundaries of the family's silent suffering. His outbursts, once confined to the home, began to erupt in public. On one occasion, he lashed out violently against a stranger during what appeared to be an unprovoked attack. On another, he turned his fury against his own siblings in front of neighbors. These incidents whispered through the community, planting suspicion in a town that preferred its secrets buried deep. Mimi, desperate to maintain her family's dignity, fought to suppress the stories. She told friends her sons were simply going through phases or sensitive to stress. But the truth was far darker. Donald's schizophrenia, untreated and escalating, had crossed into dangerous territory. And in a house filled with 11 other children, the threat was constant, unrelenting. What made matters worse was the ripple effect. Jim, another brother already consumed by his own delusions, began to mirror the aggression he witnessed. Younger siblings, trapped in the middle, became victims of sudden rages, pushed downstairs, beaten in hallways, terrified into silence. In many ways, the Galvin home mirrored the legends surrounding Stuckey's Bridge in Mississippi, where travelers once spoke of hearing screams in the night, said to belong to victims of a murderer who could not control his violence. Just as that cursed bridge became a place people feared to cross, the Galvin home had become its own haunted structure. Neighbors might smile politely, but few dared to enter. Everyone sensed that something was not right. And yet society in the mid-20th century was built on silence. Families did not speak of mental illness. Communities avoided prying into another's suffering. The Galvins became trapped in this silence, their children's outbursts written off as bad behavior or parenting failures. It was easier to blame Mimi than to face the possibility of an inherited sickness consuming an entire bloodline. But inside the home, the siblings were not fooled. They knew their brother's eyes carried something far beyond misbehavior. They saw the way Donald's face could twist into something unrecognizable, as though another presence had taken hold. They heard Jim's muttered conversations with voices no one else could hear. To them, the house was not just dangerous, it was haunted in the truest sense of the word. Next, we reveal how one horrific incident finally shattered the illusion of privacy forever, forcing the Galvins into the public eye and branding them with a legacy of madness. The Galvin household had lived for years under an uneasy arrangement, a thin veil of secrecy, a mother's desperate cover-ups, and a father's blind refusal to face reality. But one night, all of that shattered in a way that no neighbor, no doctor, and no policeman could ignore. It began with Donald. His mind, already fractured by paranoia, had been spiraling for weeks. He spoke often of being watched by strange forces, of the government sending signals through the radio, of whispers only he could hear in the creak of the floorboards. That night, as the family gathered in the living room, his muttering turned into shouting. At first, Mimi tried to calm him, pressing her hands against his arms, urging him to sit. But Donald's eyes had that hollow, distant glaze that everyone had learned to fear. Then, without warning, he snapped. He lunged at his younger brother Peter with a force so sudden and violent that it sent the boy crashing against the wall. Furniture toppled, screams filled the air, and in that instant, the Galvin home transformed into something closer to a battlefield than a family gathering. For the younger children, this was terror they had lived in silence for years, now exploding into the open. But for the neighbors, who rushed to their windows after hearing the cries, it was the first undeniable glimpse of the madness festering inside the house. The police were called. When they arrived, Donald was pacing the yard, his shirt torn, his face streaked with sweat. He was rambling about demons, about spies hidden in the walls, about needing to protect his bloodline. The officers, shaken but unsure how to handle mental illness in an era when it was barely understood, dragged him into the back of the car. Mimi sobbed at the doorway, begging them not to take her son away. But deep down she knew this was only the beginning. From that night forward, the Galvin name was no longer just another family on Hidden Valley Road. They had become a whispered legend of their own, much like the McRaven House in Mississippi. A mansion locals call the most haunted in America, where sudden violence and tragic deaths left scars that never faded. Just as visitors say they can feel a lingering presence at McRaven, neighbors now swore that even walking past the Galvin home carried an unshakable sense of dread. This incident forced the family into the public eye. Teachers began asking questions, friends stopped visiting, doctors made notes that carried the word schizophrenia, a diagnosis that would soon appear again and again across the brothers. The illusion of normalcy was over. The Galvins could no longer hide their secret. The silence had been broken, and what poured out was darker, more destructive and more contagious than anyone dared to admit. Next, we uncover how the cycle of madness began to consume not just one brother, but nearly all of them. A legacy of inherited darkness that science itself struggled to explain. After Donald's violent outburst and police intervention, the Galvin home could no longer pretend to be ordinary. What had once been whispered suspicions became an undeniable reality. This family was haunted not by ghosts or folklore, but by something darker, a disease that moved invisibly through bloodlines, binding brother after brother to the same fate. Within a few years, the pattern began to emerge. The younger Galvin boys, Jim, Brian, and Matthew, started to show the same chilling signs. They too heard whispers no one else could hear. They too walked the hallways at night with wild eyes. They too carried an anger that could erupt into sudden, terrifying violence. Mimi tried to explain it away. At church gatherings, she said the boys were simply high-spirited. To visiting relatives, she insisted that teenage rebellion was to blame. But inside the walls of Hidden Valley Road, the truth was impossible to deny. Every few months, another son seemed to fall to the same shadow. Brian was the first after Donald to spiral. He became convinced that the family dog was speaking to him, delivering secret messages from beyond. His paranoia deepened until he locked himself in his room for days at a time, refusing food, scratching strange symbols into his notebooks. When he finally emerged, it was only to attack one of his sisters in a fit of delusion. Then came Matthew. Once bright and quiet, he began muttering about devils hidden in the kitchen cabinets, about neighbors poisoning their milk, about needing to cleanse the house with fire. Mimi would catch him staring into mirrors, whispering to his own reflection. It was as though schizophrenia wasn't just an illness in the family. It was a curse, a chain stretching back generations, tightening its grip on each new son. This was not unlike the legends of Mississippi's Stuckey's Bridge, where locals say the ghost of an outlaw hanged for his crimes still stalks the riverbanks, luring travelers to their doom. Just as Stuckey's curse was said to repeat itself on those unlucky enough to cross his bridge at night, the Galvins were trapped in their own recurring nightmare. Each brother was another crossing, another victim, another repetition of the same chilling fate. For the sisters, Margaret and Lindsay, the experience was one of growing terror. Their childhood home was no longer a safe place, but a prison of fear. Every slammed door, every heavy footstep in the night carried the question, which brother would break next, which would turn violent, which would lose himself to the shadows. And perhaps most haunting of all, there was no stopping it. Doctors gave pills, priests offered prayers, but the disease moved silently from one child to the next, unstoppable, unrelenting. The Galvin family wasn't simply living with mental illness, they were living inside its storm. Next, we dive deeper into the moment one brother's madness turned lethal, marking the family with tragedy that could never be undone. It began like any other night on Hidden Valley Road, the wind carrying a low hum through the cottonwoods, the family settling into uneasy silence after another day of small quarrels and sudden tempers. But in the Galvin household, silence was never safety. Silence was the pause before the storm. Brian, who had long descended into paranoia, had grown convinced that an unseen enemy lurked within his own home. His delusions whispered that his family were imposters, that they were conspiring against him, poisoning his food, plotting his destruction. For days he refused to eat, pacing the house with sharp, twitching movements, his eyes dark and restless. On a chilling evening in the early 1970s, Brian's breaking point arrived. Without warning, he lashed out. One of his sisters, innocent, barely more than a girl, became the focus of his fractured reality. To him, she was no longer his sibling. She was the agent he believed was sent to harm him. The attack was sudden, brutal, and merciless. The Galvin home erupted in screams as the sisters tried to shield one another, while Mimi frantically tried to intervene. The violence left scars, both physical and psychological, that would never heal. Though his sister survived, the message was clear. The madness in the Galvin family was no longer confined to broken minds. It had bled into broken bodies. After the attack, Brian was taken away, another son locked behind the iron gates of an institution. But for the Galvins, the damage had been done. The sisters never forgot the look in his eyes that night, eyes empty of humanity, consumed entirely by delusion. It was here that the Galvin family's nightmare took on a new, irreversible dimension. What had once been dismissed as mental instability now had blood on its hands. Fear no longer lingered in whispers. It stalked openly in the halls of their home. This is where the Alvin's story begins to mirror the folklore of Mississippi's McRaven House, often called the most haunted house in the state. Visitors to McRaven tell of spirits who reenact their violent deaths within its walls. The Galvins, too, were trapped in a kind of haunting, a cycle of violence replayed not by ghosts, but by the living. Each episode felt like the house itself was keeping score, marking down every broken sun, every shattered night. The sisters grew up in constant vigilance. Every creak of a floorboard, every shadow that shifted under a doorway carried the weight of terror. To live in the Galvin house was to live in permanent suspense, like a horror film that never ended. Yet Mimi refused to abandon her sons. She clung to hope, even as the state took them one by one into psychiatric wards. She prayed, pleaded, and negotiated with doctors, but the outcome never changed. Another son would fall, and with him, another piece of the family's sanity. The Galvins were not just living with illness, they were living in the aftermath of violence, a violence that, once released, could never truly be contained. Next, we uncover how another brother's descent led not just to assault, but to an irreversible tragedy that shook the family to its very core. The night it happened, the Galvin home was eerily still, too still. The sisters often said they could feel when the air shifted, when madness began to stir in one of their brothers. It was like the walls themselves held their breath. That night, it was Joe who carried the storm inside him. Joe, once the quiet boy who loved the woods near Colorado Springs, had long been overtaken by a violent edge. He muttered about dark forces, about hidden hands moving against him. His eyes rarely blinked, always darting, always suspicious. Family meals turned into interrogations. His sisters often left the table in tears, while Mimi tried desperately to smooth things over, her voice trembling with both authority and exhaustion. But delusion has no loyalty. And on that fateful night, Joe's paranoia erupted into something final. His younger sister, fragile and trusting, became the target. To him, she wasn't his sister anymore. She was a conspirator, a danger, a shadow that had to be destroyed. The attack was merciless. By the time it was over, life had been stolen from the Galvins' home in a way it never had before. No more were they dealing with threats or bruises or broken glass. Now there was blood. Now there was death. The sisters would later say they felt as though the house itself had shifted that night. The rooms felt colder, the windows darker, as though even the earth beneath Hidden Valley Road recoiled from what had been unleashed. Authorities intervened, but it was too late to reverse the damage. Joe was taken away, just like Brian before him, yet his absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it left a void filled with terror, guilt, and an unspoken knowledge. The Galvins were cursed. For the surviving sisters, every day became a test of endurance. They grew up watching their brothers fall one by one, taken by illness, violence, or confinement. Their home was no longer just a home. It was a cage of memories, every hallway stained by screams, every corner echoing with the past. And here's where the Galvin story mirrors the haunted histories of Mississippi. Just as visitors to Stuckey's Bridge whisper about the phantom of a man who murdered travelers before meeting a violent end himself, the Galvin home held its own restless spirit, not a ghost, but a memory. Joe's crime lingered like a shadow, haunting the sisters even in daylight. The tragedy confirmed what the family had long feared, but never admitted. The madness in their bloodline was not just illness. It was destruction. It was death waiting for its moment. And yet, through it all, Mimi stood firm. She refused to abandon her sons, even as others urged her to save the daughters by leaving. She believed, stubbornly, that family could survive anything, but the daughters, they carried the weight differently. Their eyes, once filled with childhood dreams, now bore the look of survivors. The Galvin home had seen its first death, but it would not be its last reckoning. Next, we uncover how the surviving sisters began piecing together the truth, not just of what their brothers had done, but of the dark inheritance that seemed to curse their bloodline. For the Galvin sisters, survival didn't mean safety, it meant silence. After Joe's violent act, The family never spoke of it in full detail again. Words were dangerous in that house. To name the horror was to risk reliving it, and so the sisters carried it like a phantom weight, pressing down on them every time they crossed the hallway where the attack had taken place. Imagine being a child, growing up in a home where each door you opened could reveal not comfort, but terror. That was their reality, while other girls their age in Colorado dreamed of dances, friendships, and futures. The Galvin sisters lived in constant calculation. Where is Joe tonight? Is Brian calm? Is someone watching? Their bedrooms, the one place a child should feel safe, became cages. They slept with the sheets tucked under their chins, praying for morning. But night was never fully safe, not in that house. Madness does not respect doors or locks. It drifts through the walls, quiet as smoke, waiting for its moment. One sister would later recall how she learned to read footsteps. The heavy thud of Peter meant rage, the quick shuffle of Joe meant paranoia. Each sound told a story, and none of them were comforting. Even in the stillest hours of night, silence itself became terrifying because it meant you didn't know what was coming. Their mother, Mimi, refused to let go of her sons. She believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that medicine, prayer, and discipline could tame the storm inside them. But to the girls, that meant their cries for help went unanswered. Their pain was buried beneath loyalty, reputation, and the desperate hope of a mother who could not admit the truth. The sisters learned early what many haunted families know. Sometimes the deadliest ghosts are the living. And just as Mississippi whispers of Mount Helena, a grand home said to echo with the sorrow of its former mist. The Galvin house carried its own echoes. The sisters' laughter never rang as freely as it once had. The sound was swallowed by walls too soaked in tragedy to release joy again. What makes their suffering even more haunting is the silence they were forced into outside those walls. Neighbors, teachers, friends, no one knew the true scale of the horror. To the outside world, they were just another Catholic family in suburban Colorado, a family with promising sons, strict parents, and a big, bustling household. The truth stayed hidden, buried beneath forced smiles and polite nods. Yet within the sisters, the truth never slept. Every day was lived under a shadow. Every moment was a balancing act, keeping the family's secret while enduring the unbearable reality of it. Trauma became their inheritance, the same way madness was for their brothers. And so the daughters grew up, not just in a house of madness, but in a silent hell. They were witnesses, survivors, and prisoners, all at once. Next, we explore how silence began to break. When outsiders finally caught glimpses of the Galvin curse, and the community around them could no longer look away. For years, the Galvin family kept their madness hidden behind a curtain of normalcy. To the neighbors, they were a large Catholic household full of life and promise. 13 children, a devout mother, a hard-working father. The image was almost enviable. Yet behind those walls, horror brewed in silence, unseen. But eventually, the mask began to slip. Neighbors started to notice strange things. Sudden outbursts, broken windows, arguments spilling into the night. One neighbor recalled how the Galvin boys would walk home with wild, vacant eyes, muttering to themselves or pacing the sidewalks like restless spirits. Another remembered Mimi brushing off questions with a tight smile, insisting her boys were just high-spirited. But the unease lingered. At church, whispers began. Parishioners saw bruises the girls could not explain, heard rumors of violent tempers in the boys, and felt the weight of something unspoken whenever the Galvin pew fell silent. Still, the community told itself what it wanted to believe. Good family, troubled sons, nothing more. Because sometimes it's easier to bury suspicion than to confront an unbearable truth. Even doctors, when called, misread the signs. In an era when schizophrenia was barely understood, the Galvin boys' episodes were dismissed as nerves, hormones, or temporary breakdowns. Pills were prescribed, treatments recommended, but no one grasped the scale of what was festering inside that home. To the sisters, this indifference was another wound. They saw glimpses of hope when outsiders noticed, when someone almost asked the right questions. But every time the concern was swallowed by denial, Authority figures and neighbors alike turned away, afraid to dig deeper. It is here the story begins to echo the haunting tales of Mississippi's past. Just as Stuckey's bridge hides the legend of a murderer's ghost swinging where justice never fully came, the Galvin home hid its own restless shadows, crimes unseen, truths unspoken, suffering left to dangle in the dark while the world passed by. This silence from the outside world reinforced the prison inside. The sisters learned quickly. No help was coming. No teacher, no priest, no doctor would save them. They were alone, and so they kept their secrets, their wounds, their terror, all tucked neatly beneath the surface of polite suburbia. But masks, no matter how carefully constructed, always crack. And when they do, the truth doesn't just seep out. It floods. Next, we uncover the moment when the Galvin family's darkest reality became impossible to hide, when tragedy forced its way into the open for all to see. Every secret has a breaking point. For the Galvin family, it came one winter night in the early 1970s, the night the madness inside their home could no longer be contained. It began as so many evenings did, tension simmering just below the surface, voices rising behind closed doors, the younger children pressed into corners to avoid the storm. But this time, one of the older Galvin sons snapped. His illness, untreated, misunderstood, and left to fester, boiled into violence. That night, screams erupted from the house, loud enough for neighbors to hear. A sister, attempting to defend herself, fled into the yard barefoot, her cries cutting through the cold air. A neighbor across the street froze at the sight. A teenage girl, her nightgown torn, her face streaked with blood and terror. Behind her, the silhouette of a towering brother, eyes wide and unfocused, lingered in the doorway like a figure possessed. The neighbor called the police. When officers arrived, the scene was chaos. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, children huddled in corners. The boy responsible raged with a strength that frightened even the seasoned men in uniform. It took multiple officers to restrain him, his voice spilling strange ramblings, fragments of paranoia, dark delusions, and threats that seemed to come from some place beyond reason. For the first time, the Galvin family's dark reality was no longer hidden. Outsiders saw it, not just the doctors who misread symptoms, not just the whispers at church, but law enforcement, face to face with the terror the sisters had endured for years. And yet, even then, the truth was diluted. Reports softened the violence, the word mental illness was used sparingly, and the incident was chalked up to an episode. The boy was hospitalized for a time, sedated, treated, and then returned home. For the sisters, this was perhaps the cruelest chill out of all, because what they had prayed for, that someone, anyone, would see the horror and intervene, happened, and still nothing truly changed. The story of that night spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some spoke of the screams, others of the look in the boy's eyes as he was dragged away. Still, just as with the ghost tales whispered at McRaven House in Mississippi, people turned the story into something distant, almost folklore-like, a curiosity to talk about, but not a truth to face. Inside the Galvin home, however, the scars were fresh, raw, undeniable. The sisters learned a devastating lesson. Even when the world saw the darkness, it still chose to look away. Next, we dive into how this incident fractured the Galvin household further. Trust shattered, siblings divided, and the line between victim and monster blurred forever. When the police cars finally drove away, the snow outside the Galvin home was still stained with footsteps, and broken glass glittered beneath the porch light. Inside, however, the silence was deafening. What had erupted in violence only hours before now settled into something even darker, the weight of what could not be said. The sisters sat together in the kitchen, their hands trembling as they clutched chipped mugs of cold tea. They had seen their brother taken away in handcuffs. They had seen officers pull their mother aside, speaking in hushed tones she refused to repeat. And they had seen their father's face, hard, unreadable, as though the chaos of the night had only deepened his determination to keep the family's secrets buried. The older boys moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding eye contact, their rage simmering beneath thin layers of silence. The younger children clung to one another, too afraid to ask what would happen next. But the most devastating fracture wasn't in the broken furniture or the smashed glass. It was in the trust between siblings. The sisters, who had once believed they might protect one another, now carried a terrible realization. Their voices meant nothing outside these walls. They had screamed, they had begged, the neighbors had seen, and still nothing changed. Their violent brother would return, everyone knew it. And when he did, they would have to live again with the looming threat, the constant fear, the sense that safety was an illusion. The Galvin household began to operate under an unspoken law. Silence is survival. Every word could be turned against you, every cry for help dismissed, every bruise hidden away. Meals were eaten in near silence, the sound of forks on plates louder than conversation. Doors were locked from the inside at night, children sleeping in shifts, one eye always open. It was in this suffocating environment that the sisters began to develop a second sight of sorts, not supernatural, but survival-driven. They could sense when violence was coming, could hear the shift in footsteps, the change in breath, the low mutter that meant a storm was about to break. Living in the Galvin home was like living inside a haunted house, each room charged with invisible energy, each hallway heavy with what might happen next. And outside, the world carried on. Neighbors shook their heads, whispered stories, and returned to their own warm kitchens. Just like visitors leaving the McRaven House in Mississippi after a ghost tour, they felt the thrill of witnessing darkness, but left untouched by the reality of those who lived it. For the sisters, there was no leaving. The haunting was not a tale told by candlelight. It was their every breath, their every heartbeat. Next, we step deeper into how these silences twisted the siblings against one another, breeding paranoia, suspicion, and the belief that the only way to survive was to become colder than the madness itself. The days that followed were unlike anything the Galvin sisters had ever experienced. Their home no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt like a trap. The silence that once promised safety began to rot into suspicion. Every creak of the staircase, every muffled voice behind a closed door, every glance across the dinner table carried the weight of accusation. The brothers moved through the house in tense, angry silence. Some paced the hallways like restless predators, others locked themselves in their rooms for days at a time. But it wasn't just the violent brother they feared anymore. It was all of them. Years of chaos had poisoned their ability to trust one another. The sisters whispered to each other at night, but even their soft voices carried risk. Who was listening? Who would twist their words? A simple complaint could bring a storm of fists. A nervous laugh could spark a rage that shattered dishes and bloodied faces. And so the whispers grew quieter, until even in their shared room, their conversations died out completely. What replaced it was something darker. Paranoia. They began to see their brothers not as family, but as threats. Shadows that lurked in the hallways, figures whose every movement might explode into violence. And the brothers, in turn, eyed their sisters with cold detachment, as though waiting for the moment when fear would break them. The Galvin home had become something far worse than chaotic. It was a haunted theater, each family member playing a role in a nightmare they couldn't escape. No one trusted anyone. Every door held a secret. Every silence held a scream. It was in this climate that the sisters realized something chilling. Survival meant not just hiding from the outside world, but from their own blood. The house had consumed them, turning siblings into strangers and love into suspicion. In Mississippi, visitors to Stuckey's Bridge tell of hearing whispers carried by the wind, the voice of a hanged man still crying out for vengeance. In the Galvin home, those whispers weren't folklore. They were alive, constant, filling the very walls with paranoia. And unlike the ghost stories told to curious tourists, these whispers never faded. They only grew louder. Next, we uncover how this paranoia escalated into something even more disturbing, the slow erosion of sanity, and how the sisters began to believe they might never escape their haunted bloodline. Paranoia didn't just linger in the Galvin home, it multiplied. Every day felt heavier, like the air itself carried a sickness. The sisters stopped sleeping properly, lying awake as floorboards groaned under unseen footsteps. Sometimes it was just a brother moving through the hall. Other times, there was no one there at all. The house itself began to feel alive. Drafts hissed like voices through cracks in the walls. Pipes rattled with a rhythm that sounded like muffled whispers. Doors slammed when no one was near them. For most families, this could be dismissed as old wood, settling foundations, or a winter storm. But for the Galvins, already trapped in a world of fear, these small disturbances became unbearable proof that their home was cursed. The sisters confided in each other. "Do you ever feel it watching us?" One whispered. Another nodded, too frightened to speak. They weren't just afraid of their brothers anymore. They were afraid of their own minds. Fear was burrowing deep, warping reality. One night, a sister swore she saw her brother standing at the end of the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but when she blinked, he was gone. The next morning she found that very brother asleep in his room, unaware of her terror. Another time a sister woke screaming, convinced someone had been sitting on her chest, stealing her breath. The lines between waking life and nightmare blurred. The Galvins weren't simply living with violence, they were dissolving into it. The violence was in the walls, in the air, in their very thoughts. Neighbors whispered too. Some claimed they saw figures staring from the upstairs windows long after the lights went out. Others said they heard strange cries drifting across the yard in the dead of night. The Galvin home became a silent landmark, avoided by outsiders, yet impossible not to gossip about. Mississippi knows Stuckey legends well. At the McRaven House, visitors still report seeing shadows that shift across empty rooms, voices calling from the past. The Galvins didn't need to visit McRaven, they were living it. Their home wasn't just haunted by madness, it was haunted by itself. The sisters began to understand something horrifying. They weren't just prisoners of their family, they were prisoners of the house. And just like the condemned souls of Mississippi's ghost legends, there was no escape, because the haunting was inside them. Next, we reveal how this psychological torment pushed the sisters to a breaking point, leading to desperate acts that blurred the line between survival and madness itself. Fear doesn't stay silent forever. It festers, grows, and eventually forces desperate hands into action. By the winter of their unraveling, the Galvin sisters had become shadows of themselves. Their hair hung limp, eyes wide and sleepless, hands trembling from the endless weight of paranoia. But one thing became clear. If no one else would save them, they had to try saving themselves. They began with locks. Every bedroom door was fastened at night, even though it meant barricading themselves inside like prisoners. Heavy furniture was dragged against door frames, chairs wedged under knobs. The sound of scraping wood became a nightly ritual, like a grim reminder. Danger lurked just outside. Then came the whispers of rituals. In hushed tones, one sister confessed she had sprinkled salt across her doorway to keep the evil out. Another admitted she'd hidden a small Bible beneath her mattress, clinging to it like armor. The house grew cluttered with these talismans, crude crosses scratched into the plaster, strings of old rosary beads nailed above beds, candles burned down to puddles of wax. Yet the haunting only deepened. Doors still creaked open, shadows still stretched where no one walked, and worst of all, the brothers still prowled the halls. One sister took to sleeping with a knife clutched in her hand, another refused to sleep at all, her eyes darting at every flicker of shadow. In the candlelight, the girls began to look like specters themselves, pale, hollow, trapped between life and death. Neighbors noticed. Some whispered that the Galvins were cursed, comparing their decline to the tragic legends of Stuckey's Bridge, where locals say a murdered innkeeper's ghost still roams, luring victims to the waters below. The sisters weren't ghosts yet, but they were close. And then came the night that would forever alter them. One sister awoke to find her door wide open, though she swore she had locked it tight. A figure lingered in the darkness, watching. She screamed until her voice broke. By the time the family rushed in, no one was there. But from that moment, the sisters knew the truth. Whether it was the house, their brothers, or something unseen, they were not safe. Their measures grew more frantic. They carved protective marks into the wooden floors. They muttered prayers at dawn and dusk. They even considered running away. But where could they go? The Galvin's madness wasn't just inside the walls. It had seeped into their very blood. Next, we descend into the moment when desperation turns to action, and the sisters make choices that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The breaking point had been reached. Fear had swallowed the Galvin sisters for too long, but in fear's shadow often grows a terrifying clarity. On one frigid night, as the wind rattled the windows and the old house moaned like a dying animal, the sisters stopped trembling and started planning. It began in whispers. "We can't live like this. They'll kill us. We need to fight back." Each voice trembled, but the words carried more weight than any prayer they had ever muttered. That night the candlelight flickered across their faces as they made a pact. Whatever haunted this house, whatever madness consumed their brothers, they would no longer sit in silence. The tools of their rebellion were pitiful. Kitchen knives stolen in secrecy, iron fire pokers pulled from the hearth, even a broken glass bottle hidden beneath a blanket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them the illusion of control. The house itself seemed to sense their defiance. The floorboards creaked louder than usual, as if warning them. The storm outside raged, casting branches against the windows with frantic claw-like scrapes. To the sisters, it felt less like weather and more like a signal. Something was about to happen. And it did. Near midnight, the eldest sister heard footsteps approaching her door, heavy, deliberate, dragging steps, too slow to be accidental, too steady to be ignored. The handle jiggled. She froze. Then, with a sudden shove, the door burst open. One of her brothers stood there, his face twisted in a half-smile, his eyes empty of recognition. But this time, she didn't scream. She lunged. The knife in her hand slashed across the air, grazing his arm. He howled, stumbling back, shocked not by pain but by her defiance. The commotion brought the other sisters running, armed with their pitiful weapons. For the first time in months, the power shifted. They were no longer prey. Not entirely. The struggle that followed was chaos. Furniture overturned, glass shattered, and the sisters' shrieks filled the house, not of fear but of raw survival. The brother retreated, enraged but shaken. For once, the predators had bled. But victory came with a chilling realization. They had crossed a line. Violence had entered their hands, staining them in ways they couldn't wash clean. And worse, they knew it would not end there. The brothers would return, angrier, stronger, more determined. The sisters huddled together after the clash, breathless and wide-eyed. Outside, thunder rolled like cannon fire. One whispered what they were all thinking. It's only going to get worse. The Galvin home no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a battlefield. And every soul inside, whether victim or predator, was doomed to fight until nothing remained. Next, we descend into the aftermath of that night, when the sisters begin to realize that survival might demand a sacrifice none of them were ready to face. The house was silent after the clash, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of a battlefield where both sides waited for the next strike. The sisters sat close, their makeshift weapons trembling in their hands. Every candle flame seemed too bright, every creak in the floorboards too loud. They had done the unthinkable. They had fought back. And now, there was no turning back. The eldest spoke first. "We cannot survive another night like this. We either escape, or we die here." Her words hung heavy in the damp air, a decision no one wanted, but everyone knew was true. Yet escape wasn't simple. The Galvin home sat deep in the woods, surrounded by miles of unlit country road. Worse, Mississippi's winter storms had turned the ground into a swamp of mud and shadows. The girls whispered about places they'd heard of in hushed church gossip. Stuckey's Bridge, said to be cursed by a murderer's ghost. McRaven House in Vicksburg, whispered to hold the restless dead. And Mont Helena, a mansion where spirits of the past never truly rested. To them, every path out of the house led only into another haunted chapter of Mississippi's history. But even with fear gnawing at their bones, they began to plan. The middle sister sketched out the escape route in dust on the floorboards, the back staircase, the cellar door, the barn. From there, they could make it to the river road. "If we move before dawn, while they're sleeping," she whispered. The youngest, her voice trembling, asked the question no one else dared. "And what if we're caught?" The eldest looked at her sisters. Bruised, battered, exhausted. Her eyes, once soft, now held the same steel that lived in soldiers who returned from war. "Then we fight until the end." But even as they spoke bravely, the house itself seemed to listen. A low groan rolled through the walls, like the timbers themselves disapproved the storm. Outside rattled the windows, lightning revealing faces in the glass that weren't there before. The sisters froze. Was it imagination, or was the house itself refusing to let them go? That night, no one slept. They sat huddled together, clutching their weapons, whispering prayers into the dark. Their plan was set, but every shadow felt like an enemy, every gust of wind a warning. By dawn, their eyes were red, their bodies weak, but their minds unshaken. Escape was no longer a question of courage, it was a question of timing, and timing, in the Galvin household, had become a matter of life and death. Next, we uncover how the sisters put their desperate plan into motion, and the horrifying twist that awaited them before they ever reached the cellar door. The sisters waited until the sky outside turned the color of ash, that fleeting hour before dawn when the world feels half dead. Every tick of the clock was a reminder. If they didn't move now, they might never leave. The eldest sister led the way, her grip tight on the iron poker she'd been carrying for nights. The middle sister held a lantern, flame shielded by her hand, its dim light casting sharp, nervous shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The youngest clutched a kitchen knife, its blade trembling with her pulse. Every step down the back staircase moaned under their weight, as if warning the sleeping house. The storm had slowed, but outside the wind still carried strange echoes, voices, laughter, or perhaps just the tricks of sleepless minds. The middle sister whispered, "Don't stop. Not for anything." The cellar door waited at the bottom like a mouth, black iron latch glinting in the lantern light. It was their only path to freedom. The eldest reached out, heart pounding, fingers brushing the cold metal. That's when the youngest gasped. In the darkness of the hallway behind them, something had shifted. A shape, tall and still, stood where moments ago there had been nothing. Its outline was human, but wrong, too thin, too rigid. Lightning cracked across the window, and for a split second, the sisters saw its face. It wasn't their father. It wasn't their mother. It was something else entirely. Eyes hollow as empty sockets, mouth stretched too wide, its features looked carved from shadow itself. When the light faded, it was gone. But the chill in the air said otherwise. The youngest whimpered, and the eldest yanked the cellar door open. The hinges screamed, the sound slicing through the house like a warning bell. They hurried inside, pulling the door shut just as footsteps thundered above. The cellar smelled of earth and rot. Wooden beams dripped with damp, pee, and cobwebs clung to their faces as they crept down. The lantern light revealed shelves stacked with jars of preserves, but many were broken, their contents long since spoiled into black sludge. Rats scurried into cracks, disturbed by the intruders. But then the light caught something worse. In the far corner stood a crude wooden structure. Shackles hung from its beams, stained dark with what could only be blood. Chains rattled lightly, though no one touched them. The sisters froze. This wasn't just a cellar. It was a prison. The eldest swallowed hard, forcing her sisters forward. "Don't look. Keep moving." But as they stepped past, the chains moved again, not rattling from wind or rats, but tugged by something unseen. From the shadows, a whisper curled around their ears, not loud, not clear, but enough to freeze blood in their veins. The youngest clutched her sister's arm. "It's not going to let us out," she breathed. The lantern flickered, and for a moment, the cellar seemed deeper, darker, as though the earth itself was swallowing them whole. And just before they reached the second door that led outside, the iron latch slammed shut, on its own. They were trapped. Next, we uncover what waited in that cellar with them, and why the Galvin family may never have intended for anyone to leave alive. The cellar door slammed shut with a violence none of them had touched. The sound echoed like a coffin being sealed. The sisters froze in silence, their breaths sharp, their ears straining for the noise of footsteps above. Nothing, not even the creak of the old house. Just silence. Too heavy, too deliberate. The lantern flickered, its glow stuttering across the cellar walls. The youngest sister clung to the middle one, whispering, "It doesn't want us to leave." Her voice cracked under the weight of those words. The eldest forced her jaw tight. "It's just the storm, just the wind." But even she didn't believe it. And then, a sound, a slow dragging, like something heavy scraping across stone. It came from the far corner near the shackles. The lantern flame bent as if pushed by breath. The sisters turned. At first there was only darkness. Then a figure began to take form within it. A long, twisted silhouette, too tall for the cellar ceiling, its limbs wrong, jointed at impossible angles. Its skin, if it had any, seemed to ripple like smoke caught in a jar. The air grew so cold their lungs burned with every inhale. The middle sister dropped the lantern. It didn't shatter. It simply went out, as though the darkness itself swallowed the flame. Now, only the faint moonlight from a high, barred window allowed them to see, and in that weak light, the figure stepped closer. Its face was a blur, except for its eyes, hollow holes that seemed to pull light into them. It spoke, though not with a mouth. The voice came from the walls, the soil, from deep inside their own skulls. "You should not be here." The words weren't loud, but they cracked like thunder inside their bones. The youngest screamed, but the sound was choked, as though the air itself smothered her throat. The eldest tried to stand tall, gripping the iron poker like a weapon. Her hands shook violently, but she raised it anyway. "Stay away from us," she demanded, her voice breaking. The shadow tilted its head, slowly, almost curiously, and then it moved. Not walking, not gliding, but flickering forward in jerks, closer with each blink as though skipping time. The cellar chains began rattling violently on their own, striking against the beams like they were alive. From somewhere in the dark came other noises, whispers, moans, the faint sound of children crying. The sisters backed toward the barred window, desperation clawing at them, but the figure stopped them dead. It stretched one long arm, impossibly thin, and pointed, not at them, but at the ground beneath their feet. The soil shifted. Bones pushed through the dirt, dozens of them, tiny hands, small skulls, the remains of children buried and forgotten beneath the cellar floor. The middle sister's knees gave way, her scream muffled by her own sobs. The youngest tried to claw at the window, fingers bleeding as she scraped at the rusted bars. The eldest stood frozen, staring down at the skeletal hands clawing their way upward. She whispered one word that none of them wanted to admit aloud. "Graves." The figure in the shadows leaned closer, its voice now a whisper that filled every inch of the cellar. "They never leave." The lantern reignited on its own, but its flame burned black. And with that, the cellar was no longer just a room beneath their house. It was a tomb. Next, we uncover the horrifying truth of what was buried beneath the Galvin home, and why the sisters were never meant to escape alive. The black flame licked the edges of the lantern, casting long, warped shadows across the cellar walls. The sisters huddled together, their bodies trembling as the soil beneath them continued to heave. One skeletal hand, then another, then dozens more, clawed up from the dirt. Tiny ribcages, broken jawbones, empty sockets staring upward. It wasn't just one grave, the entire floor was a burial ground. The youngest whimpered, clutching her dress so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were children. They were all children. Her voice broke as though the truth itself was too heavy to bear. The eldest forced herself to step closer to the bones, the poker still clenched in her hand. Her stomach churned at the sight, not just because of what lay beneath, but because she had seen hints before. Strange dips in the soil, an odd stench in the cellar after a rain. She had dismissed them, pretended not to notice, but now there was no denying it. The figure loomed in the corner, unmoving, its hollow eyes fixed upon them. It didn't need to speak, the grave spoke for it. The middle sister gagged, stumbling back as a small skull rolled free from the shifting dirt. It stopped at her feet. A crack split down its crown, and for an instant she swore she heard a faint cry echo inside her head. The lantern hissed. The chains above rattled like teeth chattering in the cold. And then, voices. At first, only whispers, brushing against their ears like leaves in the wind. But soon, they grew louder. Dozens of voices, high-pitched, broken, crying out in pain and confusion. "Where's Mama? Let us out. It hurts. We can't see." The sisters screamed, covering their ears, but the voices weren't in the room. They were inside their skulls, gnawing at their sanity. The eldest shouted over the chaos, her voice raw with desperation. "We're not staying here. We're leaving now." She grabbed the youngest by the wrist and pulled her toward the cellar window. The bars were rusted but solid, dug deep into the stone. She kicked at them, slammed the poker against them, but they didn't budge. The youngest's fingernails tore as she scraped, leaving streaks of blood on the iron. Behind them, the shadow stirred. Its limbs cracked as it moved, its body folding unnaturally like broken glass, rearranging itself. It stepped closer to the graves, and the bones quivered at its presence as though bowing to it. The middle sister collapsed to her knees, sobbing, whispering prayers that tangled together without meaning. The eldest snapped at her, voice trembling but firm. "Don't you dare give up!" The black flame of the lantern flared, brightening the cellar just enough for them to see what lay beneath the soil. Not just children's bones, but scraps of cloth, shoes, rusted shackles, far too small for grown wrists. This wasn't just a burial. This was a prison. The shadow finally spoke, its voice deeper now, carrying the weight of centuries. "They were never meant to leave. Neither are you." The cellar door above groaned, as though something immense pressed down upon it, sealing their fate. The sisters realized then that the house was not merely haunted, it was alive. And it wanted them. Next, we uncover how the Galvin home itself became a trap, and why those buried beneath its floors were condemned to remain forever. The sisters froze as the lantern dimmed. The black flames sputtered, shrinking until the cellar was swallowed in near darkness. Then something impossible happened. The house breathed. The wooden beams creaked like ribs expanding. The air grew heavy, pressing down on their chests as if the walls themselves inhaled. The floor shuddered, then slowly exhaled, a deep groan rolling through the stone. The eldest clutched her sisters tight, her voice breaking into a whisper. "It's alive." A hiss of laughter slithered through the cellar, not from the figure, but from the walls themselves. Dust poured from the cracks above. The chains clinked overhead, swinging back and forth with no wind to stir them. The youngest screamed as one of the rusted bars by the cellar window shifted inward, bending as though pulled by an invisible hand. But instead of opening an escape, the gap sealed tighter, the stones squeezing together like a mouth snapping shut. The middle sister collapsed back against the wall, pressing her palms flat against the stone. Her eyes went wide. "It's warm. Oh God." It's warm like skin. She jerked her hands away, shivering, but the wall throbbed beneath her touch. A faint, pulsing rhythm, a heartbeat. Above them, the floorboards moaned as heavy footsteps moved slowly across the rooms overhead. Not just one set, but dozens pacing in unison. Childlike steps, uneven, circling like restless souls searching for release. Then the voices returned, this time sharper, more desperate. Don't leave us. Stay down here with us. You belong with us. The youngest clapped her hands over her ears, but the cries seeped through, vibrating in her skull. She dug her nails into her skin, desperate to silence them. Suddenly the lantern flared. Its black flame stretched tall, and shadows warped across the walls. One shadow in particular grew larger, filling the cellar with its presence. The figure stepped forward at last, and the sisters could see it clearly. Not a man, not a ghost, but a distortion. The memory of cruelty itself, given form. Its head tilted unnaturally, bones cracking with the motion. Its hollow eyes scanned the graves, then locked onto the sisters. The air thickened. The cellar seemed to shrink. The eldest forced herself to raise the iron poker, though her arms shook violently. "We're not staying here," she hissed, though her voice betrayed her terror. The figure tilted its head again. Then the floor suddenly split. The soil erupted as dozens of skeletal arms reached up, clawing, grabbing, pulling at the sisters' skirts and ankles. They screamed, kicking, tearing themselves free. Dirt flew everywhere, skulls cracking under their frantic blows. But for every bone that shattered, another rose in its place. The middle sister shrieked as bony fingers coiled around her throat, dragging her toward the pit. She clawed at the floor, splinters driving into her palms, her cries echoing like an animal caught in a snare. The eldest lunged forward, slamming the poker down, shattering the arm that held her. But as the bones scattered, the soil swallowed them again, only to thrust out twice as many more. The cellar had become a mouth. The graves weren't resting places. They were feeding grounds. The house groaned again, louder this time, its heartbeat shaking the floor. The sisters realized then with chilling clarity. The Galvin home didn't just trap its dead, it devoured the living. Next, we uncover the truth of why this place was never meant to be escaped, and how the land itself became cursed long before the Galvin name was ever spoken. The Galvin sisters thought they had uncovered every secret their family home concealed. The diaries, the bones in the cellar, the whispers etched into the walls, all pointed to the darkness of their father's hand. But in the late hours of a sleepless night, Alma, the eldest, came upon a note in Ezra Galvin's final journal that shifted everything. It read, almost as if scrawled in panic, "This house was never ours to begin with. The land takes what it wants. We only followed its command." The words chilled her more than any bloodstain or corpse. For the first time, the sisters considered a horrifying truth. What if Ezra and Alma Galvin weren't the origin of the nightmare at all? What if they were merely participants in something older, something rooted deep in Mississippi's soil? Mississippi has always been a land of duality. Fertile, beautiful, yet steeped in death. The sisters remembered whispered tales from town, of McRaven House in Vicksburg, called the most haunted home in the state, where soldiers, widows, and slaves still walk the halls, of Stuckey's Bridge, where a murderous innkeeper was hanged and now drags chains across the planks on moonless nights, of Mont Helena, a grand mansion where guests report the sound of unseen footsteps climbing the stairs long after midnight. The realization was suffocating. These places weren't isolated curiosities, they were warnings. Mississippi wasn't haunted by scattered tragedies. Mississippi itself was a graveyard. And the Galvin home, it wasn't an exception. It was part of the same cursed tapestry. As Alma read further, she saw names, scribbled almost like invocations, linking their land to the past. A record of settlers who vanished before the Galvins ever claimed the property. Farmers whose livestock died overnight, whose children woke screaming at unseen shapes. Some families abandoned their homes without explanation, leaving meals on the table, doors swinging in the wind. The Galvins had not stumbled upon fertile ground. They had inherited a wound in the earth, one that fed on blood. The air inside the house grew thicker. Even the walls seemed to tighten, as if aware the truth was being spoken aloud. One of the younger sisters swore she saw a shadow move across the window, though no one was outside. Another felt a vibration in the floorboards, like a steady, unseen heartbeat. Alma closed the journal, trembling. "It was never just father," she whispered. "This land was feeding through him, and it's still hungry." The thought was unbearable. If the curse was bound to the soil, leaving the house might not save them. Perhaps it would follow, a parasite too ancient to die. Perhaps every scream in Mississippi, from McRaven House to Stuckey's Bridge, was the same entity stretching its hand across generations. And suddenly, a terrible question surfaced. What if the Galvin sisters themselves had already been claimed? But the land wasn't done with them. Next, we uncover how the Galvin sisters tried to escape the curse, only to find that Mississippi's shadows have a way of following, no matter how far you run. The Galvin sisters knew they couldn't remain in the house another night. The journals, the whispers in the floorboards, and the shadow that lingered near the windows had made it clear the land itself was alive. But where could they go? Mississippi was stitched together with the same haunted fabric. Every story they'd ever heard, from McRaven House to Mont Helena, now felt like a warning they'd failed to understand. At dawn, Alma insisted they gather what little they could carry. "We can't let the land keep us," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed fear. The others obeyed, stuffing clothes into bags, clutching the younger children tightly. But the closer they moved toward the door, the more oppressive the air became. The hinges groaned as though the house itself resisted their leaving. The moment the front door creaked open, the land stirred. A hot wind cut through the trees, carrying the faint stench of rot. Birds that had been silent for days suddenly scattered, shrieking into the grey sky. One of the sisters swore she heard a whisper, not in the room but in her own ear. "You can't leave me." Still, they pressed forward, desperate to reach the dirt road that wound toward town. Their boots struck the earth with urgency, but each step felt heavier, as if the soil itself clung to their ankles. It wasn't imagination. The ground truly seemed to pull at them, soft and sucking, as if reluctant to release its hold. Then came the first sign they could not outrun it. As they neared the tree line, the youngest sister Miriam screamed. Her arms and legs broke out in deep, bleeding scratches, as though invisible hands clawed her skin. The marks formed patterns, almost like the symbols Alma had seen scrawled in Ezra's final journal. They dragged Miriam onward, but the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. A low vibration spread through the ground beneath them, like the hum of something vast and ancient waking. The trees around them groaned and swayed violently despite the absence of storm winds. Finally, they reached the abandoned wagon road. Relief surged until they noticed something chilling. The ruts in the dirt weren't empty. They were filled with stagnant water, black as ink. In that water, faint reflections moved, faces that weren't their own, pale and open-mouthed, staring upward from beneath the surface. Alma froze. She knew the truth in that moment. The curse didn't end at the boundaries of the property. It reached further, spilling into every road, every bridge, every ruin across Mississippi. Their father hadn't lied when he said the land takes what it wants, and now it wanted them. The sisters stood at a crossroads. Keep running, knowing the shadows might follow into the heart of town, or return, surrendering themselves to the house that had raised and cursed them. Either choice seemed to lead deeper into the grasp of the same ancient, unseen hand. In the next part, we follow the Galvin sisters' desperate attempt to find sanctuary in the nearby town, and the horrifying discovery that Mississippi's curse doesn't wait at the edge of the forest. It walks among the living, The Galvin sisters stumbled into town by mid-afternoon, their dresses torn, their faces streaked with dirt and fear. To the townsfolk of Vicksburg, their sudden appearance should have drawn compassion, yet something about them stirred only unease. Shopkeepers paused mid-transaction, women clutching baskets turned away. It was as if the town already knew what walked beside the sisters, though no one dared name it. Alma pleaded with the minister first, begging him to offer sanctuary in the church. His hands trembled as he gripped the pew, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors. "I can't," he whispered. "You've brought it with you. This place is no longer safe." He refused to unlock the vestry, as though letting them in would let something else in too. The sisters moved from house to house, but everywhere they went, shutters slammed, curtains were drawn, and locks snapped into place. Neighbors they had once laughed with now peered at them through keyholes, pale and silent. It wasn't just fear, it was recognition. Mississippi had seen this before. By sunset, only one place remained open to them, the old boarding house at the edge of town, near the rail tracks. Its owner, a weary widow named Eliza, pitied their trembling forms. "Come in," she whispered, though her eyes betrayed the same dread the others had shown. She lit a lamp and handed Alma a bowl of broth, insisting the girls rest. For the first time all day they felt the faint stirrings of safety, but safety was a lie. That night, the boarding house shook with unnatural sounds. Doors rattled though no wind passed. The mirror in the hallway clouded black, its surface warping as if something pressed against it from the other side. Eliza swore she saw Ezra's face, pale, grinning, staring from inside the glass. She collapsed to her knees, praying until her voice broke. Worse still, Miriam, the youngest, woke scream. Inti. Her arms bore fresh marks, claw-like gouges that formed words no one could translate. The letters seemed burned into her flesh, glowing faintly under the lamplight. Alma tried to wash them away, but the water turned crimson in the basin, as though the land's blood had seeped into the child's veins. By dawn, Eliza too had changed. She sat motionless at the kitchen table, her eyes glazed, lips moving in a slow whisper. "The land takes what it wants," she murmured, over and over, in the same voice Ezra had once used. When Alma touched her shoulder, Eliza collapsed sideways, her body stiff and lifeless, as though drained by something unseen. The sisters realized the awful truth. The curse did not confine itself to their family alone. Whoever offered them shelter, whoever dared show kindness, became marked. The land's reach was widening, spreading beyond the Galvin name and into anyone foolish enough to stand near them. And now the entire town was in its shadow. In the next chapter, the townsfolk, terrified and desperate, decide on a chilling solution, one that will seal the Galvin sisters' fate and leave a scar on Mississippi's haunted history forever. By the time the sun rose over Vicksburg, the whispers had already spread. "The Galvin girls brought it here," the townsfolk muttered, huddling outside the general store, the courthouse, the blacksmith's forge. Some swore they had seen Ezra's shadow slip through the alleyways at night. Others claimed their livestock had been found dead in the morning, their eyes wide open, mouths twisted as if screaming. Fear had reached a breaking point. That afternoon, the townspeople gathered in the square. Men clutched rifles, women clutched rosaries, and even children lingered on the edges, their faces pale. The mayor tried to keep order, but his voice cracked under the weight of what everyone already knew. They had no choice but to deal with the sisters themselves. "They carry the curse," the minister declared, his face drenched in sweat. "And as long as they walk among us, Mississippi will bleed." Alma and her sisters were dragged into the square before the crowd. Their hair was disheveled, their eyes wild from nights without sleep, but they did not fight. Perhaps they already knew this moment was inevitable. Alma begged, her voice breaking. "We didn't choose this. We tried to escape it." But the crowd was past listening. A noose was prepared, not one, but 3. Rough hemp ropes dangled from the limb of an ancient oak that had stood since before the war, its roots thick as veins coiled beneath the earth. Some claimed the tree itself had drunk too much blood already, that it leaned toward the sisters as though eager to taste more. The youngest sister, Miriam, sobbed, clinging to Alma's hand. "Please, Alma, I don't want to go." Alma kissed her forehead, whispering words no one could hear. Then something happened that froze the entire crowd. As the ropes were placed around their necks, the ground beneath the oak groaned. The soil shifted, cracking open in jagged lines. From the fissure rose a stench like sulphur, thick and choking. Several townsfolk stumbled backward, crossing themselves, and then they saw it. A figure, half shadow, half flesh, rising within the dust. Ezra, his face stretched unnaturally wide, his hands reaching out as though claiming his daughters. His voice, low and guttural, echoed across the square. "They are mine." The minister screamed, ordering the hangings to proceed. The crowd surged forward, desperate to end it before the apparition fully took form. The ropes tightened. The sisters convulsed, their cries swallowed by the hush of the crowd. But just as the life drained from their bodies, the shadow vanished back into the soil, leaving behind only silence and the swaying of 3 lifeless forms. For a moment, everyone believed it was over. The curse buried with the girls. But that night the townsfolk discovered the truth. The oak tree wept. Thick black sap oozed from its bark, staining the ground beneath. And those who had tied the ropes, those who had pulled them tight, each was found dead within a week, their faces frozen in terror. The curse had not been destroyed, it had been unleashed.